right, folks, welcome to Barley Bin Live. Our final topic for the night is focused on more yield robbers, this time on plant disease. So farming in a highly productive area like Northeast Saskatchewan, it obviously presents some additional challenges. And so managing barley for the demanding specifications in the malt industry are an added challenge to that as well. So Dr. Kelly Turkington has focused his career on field pathology and has provided the industry with his research results for 30 years?
I've been at Lacombe since 94.
Yeah,
so,
94. So barley has been an integral part of Kelly's research program, also working on wheat and dabbling into canola at various points as well. So Kelly's got a lot of experience from the industry side of things, and his role has been integral in terms of disease management, as well as doing some of the variety evaluations that Aaron alluded to in his presentation. And so Kelly sees a lot of different barley varieties and different practices throughout the industry, and is going to provide some insight on that. So Kelly's coming here from Lacombe at the Ag Canada station there. And I was on a panel last week and had a similar type of question as to what I'm going to ask Kelly. I'm not sure how it made you feel when I posed the question, but it's like it almost makes you feel a little bit old when you ask any kind of a reference to a long time in the industry. So, well, take it as a sign of respect, not a jab. So, in the fourth quarter of your career, you've seen a lot of change in the industry. What's the most critical research you've done that is yet to be adopted by the industry? And question 2, and I'll let you roll with it, Kelly. FHB, Fusarium Head Blight risk, is a difficult beast to manage. 2024 was the first year with a barley-specific FHB risk map available for producers. How should producers incorporate risk maps into their fungicide management strategies, especially when that risk may appear differently for different crop types? Kelly.
Well, thank you, Mitchell. It's a pleasure to be here. Coming to speak to producers at events like this, industry events, actually is probably one of the things that I like most about my job. Some of the other admin stuff I don't like as much, so this is always a great opportunity for me to come and speak to you. So at Lacombe, we're part of a great group. I work as part of an integrated crop management team with Brianne Tideman, our wheat scientist, and Hiroshi Kubota is our agronomist. We've got some great technical staff, great collaborators across the Prairie region with Ag Canada, with universities, with producer groups, with the Applied Research Associations, and so on. We've had some great interaction with producers, producer group representatives, and industry. So I value those interactions very much over the course of my career. We've also been very fortunate to have funding from a number of different producer groups over a number of years. So if we look at the first question, which is in the fourth quarter of your career. Now, my dad farmed around St. Brew. He was actually at Dalesford. We were about 9 miles south of St. Brew. He got out of farming in 98. So lots of fond memories of Melfort. Getting up into this area occasionally and being at the farm in St. Brew. Did a lot of my graduate work on canola and sclerotinia forecasting using pedal testing with Robin Morell. We did a lot of work at the Melfort Research Center starting in about 83 through to about 91 or so. So what's the most critical research that you've done that's yet to be adopted by industry? And quite frankly, it was a bit of a tough question. Our research program and the collaboration that I've had, we work very closely with the barley breeders across the Prairie region, including Aaron and colleagues in Brandon and Lacombe. So the varieties that come out that have improved disease resistance packages are adopted quite readily by producers. A lot of the work we do is field-based, so a lot of the concepts and technologies that we've developed or refined find themselves onto the farm quite readily. So I'm very thankful for that. So certainly research is important, but over the years, I've been mentored by producers, by industry staff, by fellow researchers, by my supervisor, Robin Morrell. And it's really some of the things that I've seen gaps in has been in the knowledge and understanding of disease issues and how to use that information to better manage plant disease risk. So the one thing that I can't emphasize enough is the importance of knowing and understanding the enemies that you're facing on your farm on a field-to-field basis. That can't be overstated. The importance of timely and accurate disease diagnosis is so important. And I've made issues over the years, or had issues. I've seen issues, whether it's producers, whether it's crop consultants, whether it's fellow researchers, and so on. Now, learning and developing that sense of being able to identify issues is going to take time. It takes several years because there are often nuances when you look at all the factors that impact that crop during the growing season, both abiotic factors like temperature stress, drought stress, hail, etc., or biotic factors like insects, insect damage, disease development, and so on. I can't also understate or overstate the importance of getting out into the field. And that's one part of the job that I enjoy the most. Each summer, I try to get off the research farm, out of that bubble, quite frankly, and into producer fields. I do a lot of interaction with crop consultants in our area, with some of the malting companies. I go out a lot with the RAR agronomists, RAR Malting, based out of Alex. So getting out into the field, looking at what's happening, getting that sense of factors in the field, and then also the extension that occurs through producer groups like SaskBarley is so valuable, and sometimes we don't recognize the importance of that. One area that we've worked on since the late 90s is fungicide application, and especially in barley and especially for leaf disease management. And there are a few things there that I want to pass on, some observations that we've made, research results, and so on. It's an effective tool, quite frankly, but when the risk of disease is sufficient. And if you're growing a variety that has a moderately resistant or a resistant rating in the variety guide, especially to the leaf spot complex, so things like net blotch, scald, spot blotch, and so on, and rust resistance especially, that genetics that the breeder has incorporated with the assistance of the pathologist is doing your heavy lifting in terms of managing disease. And often you don't need to spray a fungicide when you have that resistance package present, and especially with the rust. The challenge, and certainly Aaron would concur, is packaging resistance to all the disease issues that you face. Fusarium, stem rust, surface-borne smut, loose smut, scald, 2 types of net blotch, spot blotch, and so on. Pulling in moderate to high levels of resistance to all of those diseases at the same time in terms of selecting for high yield, selecting for the malting quality can be quite challenging. The other thing is that when you have dry conditions and or a lack of inoculum, those are conditions where you don't really need to put in that spray and incur that input cost. Timing can have a huge impact. And we started looking at timing in the late 90s, comparing herbicide, flag, and actually at that time, head emergence timing. So you can go in too late and the disease is already established on the key plant tissues that contribute to grain filling and yield. And in barley, that's the penultimate leaf, not necessarily the flag leaf, because often many of the varieties, the flag leaf is quite small and is not a big contributor to yield. It's the penultimate leaf, so the second leaf from the head and the third leaf down. So if you get a lot of disease developing on that, by the time you get your fungicide on, you're not necessarily getting the benefit to the extent that you want out of that fungicide application. You can go in and spray too early, and you don't even touch the key leaf tissues. And this graphic here is just an illustration. It was some work that we did at Lacombe. We had the same trial at Melfort, Indian Head, Scott, a couple of locations in Alberta and then Brandon. And where we put on a herbicide timing, we really don't see a huge benefit associated to that particular practice. So you go in and spray at that time, you have an impact on the healthy leaf tissue that's there, but then the disease continues to develop. And later on, when those upper canopy leaves come out, they're totally unprotected. The other thing to keep in mind is that fungicides are often only effective for 2 to 3 weeks at best. So you're wanting to maintain a concentration, a critical concentration of fungicide active within that plant tissue in order to manage the risk from those particular leaf diseases. Is your target actually a fungal disease? And I've had many examples of this over the last 30 years where I get calls or I go out to fields and the issues that are there are not disease related. They in fact could be due to drought stress and heat stress in the crop. In many cases, I've had calls where a producer would say, I've sprayed, and where I've sprayed, the disease is worse, which is a bit of a head scratcher. So I ask a lot of questions when I'm trying to diagnose issues like that. And often I'll say, did you put anything else into the mixture? And invariably, the one that was most common is some of the older generation of foliar copper products, which have a lot of phytotoxicity issues and cause some damage. So in those cases, the fungicide was doing its part. It was the fact that they had that added copper, which was a bit hot on that plant. And last but not least is that fungicide application doesn't mean a disease-free crop. And often producers might have experiences with weeds or insects where they spray, the weeds are all dead, they can see them dead, the insects are dead. That's not the same case. So I can't emphasize the importance of leaving unsprayed areas in your crop in order to look at assessing the performance of that particular input. So one of the other questions I get a lot about, and I'll touch on this a little later, in terms of assessing risk in relation to Fusarium Head Blight. When should I go in? Should I use a herbicide timing? And the research that we've done, some of the other research that's been done in wheat, really points to that the herbicide timing is not the best target to use or to hit within your cereal crop. Invariably, if you have an emerging issue and you spray at the herbicide timing, you're going to have to come back in again at flag leaf emergence or head emergence to spray that crop. And every time you spray with a fungicide, that's a selection event on that fungal pathogen population to adapt to that particular fungicide active. We're nowhere near Europe. We're nowhere near Australia in terms of their issues with fungicide resistance in cereals, but there are some concerns. I'll just wait a few seconds. There we go. So the question is, should I go in at flag only? Should I go in at heading only? Or should I go in at both the flag leaf emergence and heading? And I'll touch on that a little later on. So the second question was, FHB risk is difficult to manage. And I often use northeastern Saskatchewan when I talk to producers in Alberta and elsewhere in terms of the challenges associated with FHB management. The concept of integrated management for Fusarium Head Blight typically has come out of North Dakota and colleagues like Marshall McMullen, who's now retired at North Dakota State University. So producers in this area for the last 15 years or more have been following what, in quotation marks, the experts are recommending. Rotation, don't plant barley on barley or wheat on wheat. Use a resistant variety, spray a fungicide. They do all three of those practices, and they're still getting hammered in terms of grade reduction due to FDKs for wheat and rejection in terms of malting status in terms of DON contamination or deoxynivalenol. So 2024 was the first year that we saw the introduction of a prairie-wide Fusarium Head Blight risk map tool, and there were some challenges associated with that in terms of some variation between wheat maps and barley maps, And how do we address that? So what I'm going to do is just talk a bit about the background. So the maps that we see, whether it's in Western Canada, whether it's in the US, where they have the SCAB forecasting system. In the US, they refer to Fusarium Head Blight as SCAB. Typically, what they do is they look at output from forecasting models that look at parameters such as rainfall, temperature, relative humidity. And then those parameters are used. They use statistics to predict the potential risk or the probability of a particular level of disease occurring. And in the most cases, it's at least 10% Fusarium Head Blight severity on that cereal head. So in Saskatchewan, you had with the Sask Wheat Commission, they worked with a private company. They looked at temperature and or relative humidity in the previous 5 days, plus a 2-day forecast. The reason why I have a question mark there is that it's a private company. They were fairly cautious about releasing the nature of their forecasting system, but likely it was based on a combination of temperature and relative humidity. In Manitoba, for quite a while now, and then in 2017, I worked with people like Mike Harding with Alberta Ag, Brian Kennedy with Alberta Wheat at that time, and we introduced Alberta producers to the risk maps, and we used the forecasting system out of Manitoba, which looked at hours of precipitation and the hours with temperatures between 10 or 15 degrees C and 30 during the previous 7 days. And this was one of the first iterations of the US forecasting model developed by Eric DeWolf at Kansas State, along with Pierce Paul at Ohio State and Pierce Paul's predecessor, whose name escapes me right now. So if we look at the maps at that time, each province had their own categorization based on slightly different threshold values. So low, moderate, high, and extreme risk were the categories. If you look at the US, they looked at initially the number of hours when the temperature was between 9 and 30, so a fairly wide range of temperatures, and where the RH was above 90% over the previous 7 days. The current models, they've gone to strictly looking at mean relative humidity over a 14-day period prior to flowering. And in the newer system, you can then add in as a producer weather forecasts for the next 2, 4, or 6 days. So that's the current system. So in 2022, as a result of work by a master's student at the U of M and a project that Paul Bullock led at the University of Manitoba, and it was across the Prairie region, they looked at developing the relationships between particular parameters for individual crop types, so barley, spring wheat, durum, winter wheat, and so on. So the risk maps are calculated, and the risk from May 15th through August 31st, and they don't forecast beyond the current date, so they don't look at incorporating forecast weather conditions. They look at the previous 2-week period and weather parameters to calculate a risk level, and they've used an index value or severity value of 5% versus 10% in some of the previous models developed, especially out of the US. So what I did was I went in and I queried the system. So we looked at July 12th, 2024, spring wheat, AAC Brandon. I went in and looked at the same date, but with barley and with AAC Connect. Both of those wheat and barley varieties have a moderately resistant rating for Fusarium Head Blight. Now, if we look at the maps, so I focused in more on eastern Saskatchewan. Here's for AAC Brandon, a moderately risk. You can see that we've got large areas around Yorkton and north, east, west, that are in that very high to high range. If we look at the map for AAC Connect, a bit of a different story. So my understanding, talking with Mitchell over the course of the summer, a lot of confusion and concern related to why are we seeing the differences? And we're going to talk a bit about that in a few moments. So if we zoom in, you can see outside of the Regina area, we were transitioning from moderate to high risk. And in Regina, we were low risk for more distance outside of Regina and the low risk, eventually getting into moderate and then to high, but nothing in the very high range. So that's caused a lot of concern and questions from producers in terms of how to interpret the results. So the current system for spring wheat is based on mean daily maximum RH and the number of hours when the temperature was between 25 and 28 degrees C. So fairly high temperature conditions for the previous 14-day period. For barley, the model is based on mean daily rainfall. And initially, the US system relied on rainfall, and they focused mostly on winter wheat and spring wheat. But they've moved away from rainfall and have now focused more on relative humidity. So that may be one reason you see the difference between the two results. So how do you rectify that? How do you, if you're a barley producer and you're also got wheat, how do you deal with perhaps potentially different risk ratings on your individual farm? I think it's important to go back and look at the disease cycle of Fusarium head blight and what we're actually trying to predict and the factors that we're looking at in terms of temperature and moisture. So Fusarium is a residue-borne fungus. Whether it's in small grain cereals like wheat and barley or corn, it survives on old crop residues. On those residues, you have the production of the sexual fruiting structures, the perithecia, and that's illustrated here, which produce spores. In the past, in Alberta, we were concerned about infected seed, and it was a legitimate concern, quite frankly, especially in areas outside of southern Alberta. Planting infected seed resulted in infected seedlings. The research that we did in the early 2000s demonstrated the fungus could go from the seed to the subcrown internode to the crown tissue and up to about the third node. So it established a source of residue that then, if you followed a tight rotation, highly susceptible variety, you'd quickly build up that amount of infected residue. Now, if we look at the disease cycle, these sexual fruiting structures are the key structures that produce spores that are shot up into the air like cannonballs. They're carried by wind currents and they land on that cereal head, and the infection occurs after full head emergence and takes about 10 to 14 days under ideal conditions where you're going to see symptoms, and then the production of infected residue, which then serves as a source of disease in subsequent years. If we're looking at the forecasting system, we're really looking at the impact of those temperature and moisture parameters on production of the sexual fruiting structures, production of spores, and then the potential for those spores when they land on that cereal head to germinate and infect that head tissue. So if we look at the temperature parameters, and you need moisture, so you'd need damp conditions down on the soil surface, but in terms of temperature, the production of perithecia can occur from about 15 to 30 degrees C. It can be as low as 5, but typically the production is very low. If we look at ascospore production, it's anywhere from about 13 to 33 degrees Celsius, so fairly wide temperature range. Dispersal of the ascospores anywhere from 13 to 23 with an optimal of 16 degrees Celsius. In terms of infection, so we have these perithecia releasing ascospores, landing on the cereal heads, and within 48 to 72 hours with rain or dew or high RH above 90% and temperatures in that 10 to 30 degrees C range, we have the potential for infection. Now, the lower temperatures simply mean that you need longer periods of leaf wetness or head wetness, longer periods of high relative humidity. When you're in that 25 degrees C range, that infection is going to occur much more rapidly. So in cooler conditions, typically you need longer periods of moisture. And then you get symptoms within 10 to 14 days, depending on weather conditions, depending on the susceptibility of the variety, and so on. Now, in terms of infection, and this relates to spray timing, don't get hung up on flowering. That's one take-home message. Don't focus on that. Anthers have been identified as potentially being part of the infection process, but the research going back to the 1920s and 30s illustrate that you don't need anthers present for infection to occur. An infection can actually occur anytime from head emergence through to the start of senescence. So that wide window for infection means it's very, very difficult to get effective management of FHB using a fungicide. So if you look at Fusarium damaged kernels, which are more of a grading factor in wheat and durum wheat, the most severe development of FDKs and potential for downgrading are if infections occur close to flowering or shortly thereafter. That's where you're going to get the most severe symptoms. As that infection occurs later on during the grain filling period, especially late milk and towards the start of senescence, you can have infection, but it's superficial infection. The kernels look healthy. The grade probably isn't impacted, but the fungus is still there. And most importantly, the deoxynivalenol is there. And that can be at levels that are well above the 1 part per million sort of threshold that we have for malting acceptance, human consumption, and consumption by swine. DON development basically can occur right from the point of infection and head emergence through to the start of senescence. So that's why, especially in barley, trying to get your DON levels down below 1 part per million can be very, very challenging. And I've got wheat here, but basically, if you get earlier infections in barley, you get some shriveling of kernels, but not to the same extent as you do in durum wheat or spring wheat. What you'll get is a lot of discoloration, which the maltsters will pick up when they're evaluating your barley for malting status. The higher the discoloration, the greater potential for microbial load, which can cause problems in the germination beds and in the brewing process itself. You can also see, if you look closely, production of that sexual fruiting structure. You can see that on barley tissue even before you've combined it. Now, if you have infections that occur later, those barley kernels might appear bright, clean, uninfected, but that superficial infection is still there and your DON levels are still there. So how do we deal with this sort of difference in maps? And I like to look at the best case scenario and worst case scenario. That's sort of easy to look at. So if we have low risk where you likely do not need to spray for Fusarium Head Blight, keeping in mind that you've got leaf diseases that might be a concern. So your risk levels are low for wheat, barley, durum. That's a situation or a scenario where likely the benefit from that fungicide application for Fusarium Head Blight is going to be minimal. Conversely, if the risk levels are moderate or higher for all of these different crop types, if you put that into the tool, that's a clear indication that you're in a scenario where you need to put that fungicide on. Where things get more challenging is where it's in the middle. And my philosophy and recommendation to you would be to look at kind of the combination of factors. So if you're seeing moderate to high or higher risk in your wheat on your farm, your barley is maybe in that low to moderate, chances are, based on the impact of those weather conditions and temperature and moisture on perithecia production and ascospore production and potential germination of spores and infection of heads, you've got an issue that you probably need to take care of. Now, I like to look at simple tools, and one that comes out of some experience that I've had advising some growers. I visited a seed farm, Con Seed Farms outside of Red Deer, there to talk about Fusarium graminearum and Fusarium Head Blight. Mr. Con said, well, we're just about close to thinking about spraying for sclerotinia in our canola. Can you come out and look at our crops? So I did. And basically we went out, and it was about 10:30, 11 in the morning. The soil surface was bone dry. The crop canopy was bone dry. Our boots were dry. They're not muddy. Our pants were dry. That is a clear situation where there is limited risk of disease. In this case, it was sclerotinia, but it would apply for leaf diseases in cereals and for Fusarium Head Blight. Conversely, if you go out to that same field in the afternoon, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the soil surface is sopping wet. Your boots are wet and your pants are wet well above your knees, and you've got moisture throughout that canopy. That would be a scenario where the environmental conditions are definitely conducive to disease development. So very quickly, let's put it all together. So I'm going to give you a bit of philosophy as far as assessing leaf disease risk and when to spray and when not to spray. So again, you can be out during herbicide timing. Take note of what's there. Do you have an emerging problem that you need to take care of when the upper canopy leaf tissue is starting to emerge? It's not the best target in terms of fungicide application unless you're seeing stripe rust. If you're seeing stripe rust, especially in your wheat, at that herbicide timing, you'd better go in with a fungicide. And it's the nature of the rust. They're biotrophic pathogens. They don't kill plant tissue in order to derive nutrients. Conversely, leaf spot diseases like tan spot, septoria, net blotch, scald, spot blotch, all release toxins and enzymes depending on the fungus. And those kill plant tissues, and that fungus lives on that cell content. So the normal water conducting tissues are no longer functioning. Conversely, in stripe rust, because it doesn't kill that tissue, the fungicide has a much better ability to get into where the fungus is and to actually have an effect on it. So one aspect that you might look at if you're concerned about early season leaf disease development, and we did some work back in 2013 through 2016, and it came out of some exposure to seed treatments and the potential role for foliar disease management when I visited Australia in 2012, and especially colleagues at Horsham, north of Melbourne, about 3 or 4 hours. So some of the seed treatments, most of the actives, if they move, if they have mobility in that plant tissue, they will move with the water transpiration stream. So they'll move from the seed to the first true leaf, to the second true leaf, to the third true leaf. So seed treatment, if you are concerned or you have clients that are concerned about early season development, potentially consider a seed treatment. If you're seeing lots of disease at herbicide timing, you see it continuing to develop as you get into stem elongation and emergence of things like the penultimate leaf, the third leaf from the head, that is a clear indication that you're going to have an issue. Our rule of thumb for barley especially, and it would also apply to wheat, is we look at the third leaf from the head around flag leaf emergence. And if we're seeing more than about 1 to 2% of the area of that third leaf from the head with symptoms, chances are you're seeing a lot more further down towards the soil surface in that plant canopy. That is a clear indication that you need to spray a fungicide, either at flag leaf emergence or if it's really high, potentially when that third leaf from the head is coming out a little earlier. Now, if we go out and we don't see much disease development, herbicide timing, we really don't see much around emergence of the third leaf, the second leaf from the head or the penultimate leaf or the flag leaf. That's a clear indication that we can probably delay and wait until head emergence to put on our fungicide that gives us our FHB and DON suppression, but also provides us that leaf disease control. But that's a perfect world. We don't live in a perfect world. You're challenged by leaf diseases, so you're going to have to look at spraying potentially before flag leaf emergence, or head emergence, I should say. And again, look at what's developing in the crop. And Mitchell alluded to it. Fusarium Head Blight and Sclerotinia and canola are very similar. You need to make the decision to spray before you see symptoms. I love working with cereal leaf diseases. You can follow what's happening in the crop and use what's happening to give you key information to decide when I need to spray and if I need to spray. So again, in that situation, you may need to look at a pre-head emergence application to manage that leaf disease and then come back in at post-head emergence to top up your leaf disease control and to give you some FHB suppression. The one thing I want to emphasize is that if you see a lot of leaf disease development before head emergence, And our recent research under the barley cluster and cap from 2018 to 22 and the wheat cluster during that same period clearly illustrated if we have an emerging leaf disease problem prior to head emergence, we'd better put on a fungicide before head emergence. If we delay, we're going to compromise the level of efficacy of that fungicide. The other thing I want to talk about is timing. And the current labels for fungicides for FHB start much too early. The research, whether it's Randy Kuchar, our recent research under the barley and wheat cluster, a lot of the research out of the US clearly indicates that you want to wait until full head emergence, and that the research that we've done, that Randy's done, that out of the US, illustrates that you don't pay a penalty if you delay. In fact, it actually may have a benefit in terms of dawn management. So how do we use the risk maps? Well, I would recommend starting to follow them at flag leaf emergence. Not a time to put on that fungicide, but if the conditions, you're really looking at the production of parathecia, the production of ascospores, and whether the fungus is going to be in the air when your cereal heads come out of the boot. So if you're following the risk maps and the risk is low from flag leaf emergence through booting to head emergence, that might be a scenario where you don't need to spray a fungicide. Keeping in mind, you also may have leaf disease issues that you need to take care of. The opposite end of the spectrum, if that risk level is high, right from flag leaf emergence through to head emergence, this might be a scenario that you'd want to get in as soon after full head emergence as possible to try and get the best level of suppression of FHB and dawn as possible. Where things get more interesting, if you transition from a low risk to a high risk, so low risk at flag, high risk at head emergence, look at the next 2 weeks in terms of the weather forecast. But this might be a scenario where you can delay to the mid to the latter part of that current label application window. What's even more challenging is if it starts off at a high risk and then transitions to low. This is a tough call. I would look at what the forecast is for the next 2 weeks. I would look at what your previous experience with Fusarium Head Blight has been, whether you've had issues with downgrading and dawn contamination. And if you're advising a farmer, what is their risk aversion level? And they may be very risk averse. I don't like to take chances. And they may find some peace of mind in terms of spraying a fungicide at that time. And I'm going to end there. And I just want to leave you with one message. Again, awareness, regular disease surveillance, and crop planning will definitely provide you with a better ability to manage surprises. I'm involved with the Prairie Crop Disease Monitoring Network. There's lots of good information on the network in terms of cereal disease management, risk assessment, and so on. So please consider visiting it. We're also on Twitter. I will share with Mitchell a PDF copy of this presentation. I'll probably add a few more slides to emphasize the timing aspect in relation to leaf disease and FHB management. And Mitchell, you're more than welcome to share that. And I think I'm ready for another beer. So any questions? So the question was in terms of our temperature parameters for FHB and the current risk maps that we have are between that 25 to 28. Is that focused on Fusarium graminearum only, or how does it relate to some of the other Fusarium species that might produce dawn? And the other main one that is Fusarium culmorum. It doesn't produce the wind-borne stage like Fusarium graminearum. It's more of a root and crown disease issue, so you don't necessarily see a lot of head infection. You'd have to have a lot of rainfall to splash the spores. The asexual spores are produced in masses of spores that are splashed by rain splash. So you'd have to have a lot of moisture. The temperature parameters for culmorum might not necessarily be as warm. You look at other species of Fusarium like Poe. It tends to be the one where it's a hot, dry summer. We tend to see more Poe than we do Fusarium graminearum. The other thing is that if you look at the years that Paul Bullock and colleagues looked at developing their model. It was basically 2019 through 2021. So fairly dry years, certainly 2021, higher temperatures. So that may be a factor. Certainly Paul is very active in terms of refining the model. He's talking to us and colleagues like Hiroshi Kubota. We've got a number of trials across the prairies to try and utilize some of the barley data. We're going to look at dawn and then the weather parameters. So they're constantly going to be refining that model. Looking at the range from the states, it can occur over a fairly wide range, but I would say your parameters that would be most concerned would be in that 20 to 25 degrees C. If you get above 30, your daily highs above 30, those are conditions that may not necessarily be very conducive to Fusarium head blight development. So my email's there. Certainly send me an email, send me digital pictures. We do a lot of digital diagnosis over the course of the summer. And if you have any other questions that you want to ask, certainly shoot me an email, or I'm a bit shy, so come to me, and if you can bend my ear, like I said, I might need another beer right now. So